The rain had not stopped for 3 hours, and Alara Whitfield was beginning to think it never would. She stood by the window of her father's inn, watching the water run down the glass in silver lines, when she saw something move near the stable. At first she thought it was one of the horses, restless from the storm. Then she saw it again, a shape, low and struggling, trying to rise from the mud and failing. She did not stop to think. She grabbed a lantern and her shawl and ran out into the rain. The man was lying near the stable door, his shirt torn at the shoulder and dark with blood. His face was pale, and his eyes were half closed, but when the lantern light fell on him, he tried to speak. "Please," he whispered. "I mean no harm." Alara knelt beside him, ignoring the mud soaking into her skirts. "You're hurt. Can you stand? Lean on me." It took all her strength, and some help from the stable boy who came running at her call, to get the stranger inside. Her father, Thomas Whitfield, stood in the doorway of the inn with his arms crossed, his face full of doubt. "We know nothing about this man," he said quietly, so the stranger could not hear. "He could be a thief. He could be running from the law. He could also die in our stable if we leave him there," Alara replied. "I won't have that on my conscience, father. Not tonight." Her father sighed, the way he always did when he knew he had already lost the argument. "Take him to the loft room then, but watch him carefully." They laid the stranger on a narrow bed in the small room above the kitchen, the warmest room in the inn. Alara cleaned the wound at his shoulder, a deep cut though not as dangerous as it had first looked, and wrapped it with clean linen. Through it all, the man barely spoke, though once, when the pain must have been sharp, he gripped the edge of the blanket so tightly his knuckles turned white, yet he made no complaint. "What is your name?" Alara asked, once the wound was dressed and he seemed a little more comfortable. "Adrian," he said, after a pause that seemed just slightly too long. "Adrian Voss. And how did you come to be lying in our stable yard, Mr. Voss?" "I was traveling the road from the east," he said. "Men stopped me. They took what they wanted and left me for dead, I think. I do not remember much after that. I found my way here somehow." It was a simple story, and Alara had no reason to doubt it. And yet, something about the way he spoke made her pause. His words were too careful, too polished for a man who claimed to be a common traveler. She noticed, too, that beneath the mud and blood, his boots were made of fine leather, stitched with care no ordinary cobbler would give. And on his smallest finger, before he curled his hand into a fist and hid it beneath the blanket, she thought she saw the glint of a ring. She said nothing. It was not her place to question a wounded man on the night she had found him half dead in the rain. There would be time for questions later. The days that followed were quiet ones. Adrian's fever broke by the third morning, and though his shoulder still pained him, he insisted on getting out of bed far sooner than Alara thought wise. "You should rest," she told him, more than once. "You were badly hurt." "I have never been very good at resting," he said, with a small smile that seemed to surprise even him. "Let me help. I cannot simply lie here while you and your father work." And so, despite her protests, Adrian began to help around the inn. He chopped wood, though his hands were clearly unused to the axe at first, blistering within an hour. He mended a broken fence post, working slowly and carefully, asking Alara's father for guidance on tasks a laborer would have known without asking. He carried water from the well, swept the stable, and in the evenings, sat with Alara and her father by the fire, sharing simple meals of bread and stew. It was during these evenings that Alara came to know him, not as the mysterious stranger from the storm, but as a man of quiet thoughtfulness, who asked more questions than he answered, and who listened as if every word she said mattered. "Tell me about the village," he said one evening as the fire crackled low. "You seem troubled when you speak of it." Alara hesitated, then found herself speaking freely, as she had not done with anyone in a long time. She told him about Mr. Croft, the estate's steward, who had raised the rents twice in the past year, even as the harvests grew worse. She told him about the Hendersons, an old farming family, who had been threatened with eviction after a poor crop left them unable to pay. She told him about the fear that had settled over the village, fear of losing homes that families had lived in for generations, fear of a steward who answered to no one but the absent duke who owned the land. "The duke does not know what is happening?" Adrian asked, his voice low. "Who can say?" Alara replied, with a bitterness she rarely allowed herself. "He lives far from here, in his grand house, surrounded by his grand friends. Why would he trouble himself with the suffering of tenant farmers he has never met? Mr. Croft tells him what he wishes to hear, no doubt, and the Duke believes it, because it is easier than looking closely." Adrian was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. "Perhaps," he said finally, "he does not know how bad things truly are. Perhaps, if he knew, he would act differently. Perhaps, Ilara said, though she did not believe it. But hope is a poor meal for a hungry family, Mr. Voss. She did not notice, in that moment, how tightly Adrian's jaw had clenched, or how his eyes had darkened with something that looked very much like shame. Free. As the days turned into 2 weeks, Ilara found herself looking forward to the evenings by the fire more than she cared to admit. There was something about Adrian, his quiet strength, his careful kindness, the way he seemed to truly see her rather than simply looking at her, that she had not felt in a very long time, not since her husband had died 3 years before, leaving her a widow before she had even reached the age of 22. But there were things about him that did not add up, and the longer he stayed, the harder it became to ignore them. She noticed how he corrected himself when he spoke, as though catching words that were too fine for a common surveyor. She noticed how a passing merchant, delivering goods to the inn one afternoon, had stopped mid-sentence at the sight of him, his eyes widening, before quickly looking away and hurrying about his business. She noticed most of all how Adrian's hands, though now roughened somewhat by 2 weeks of labor, still moved with the practiced grace of a man who had spent his life holding books and pens, not axes and shovels. One evening, after her father had gone to bed, Ilara found the courage to ask him directly. "Who are you really?" she said, setting down her mending and looking at him steadily. "You are no surveyor, Mr. Voss. I have watched you long enough to know that much." Adrian's face went still. For a moment she thought he might simply get up and walk away, leaving her question unanswered. Instead, he sat back in his chair and let out a long breath. "I cannot tell you everything," he said quietly. "Not yet. But I promise you, Ilara, I mean no harm to you or your family. Everything I have told you about my care for this village, my concern for its people, that much is true, whatever else I have kept hidden." "That is not an answer." "I know," he said, "and I am sorry. But I ask you to trust me a little longer. There are reasons for my silence that I believe, when you understand them, you will forgive." She wanted to press him further, but something in his eyes, a kind of quiet pleading, mixed with something that looked almost like fear, made her stop. She nodded slowly, though her heart was troubled, and let the matter rest, for that night at least. The trouble came to a head sooner than either of them expected. Mr. Croft, the estate steward, had heard whispers of a stranger asking questions in the village, questions about rents, about harvests, about the fairness of his own management. Croft, a man who guarded his position fiercely, did not like questions he could not control. He arrived at the inn one gray afternoon, his carriage pulling up sharply outside, and demanded to see Thomas Whitfield. "I hear you have been harboring a stranger," Croft said, his voice cold and sharp. "A man who has been stirring up trouble among the tenants, asking questions that are none of his concern." "He is a guest," Thomas said carefully. "Wounded and recovering. He has done nothing wrong. See that he leaves within the week," Croft said, "or I will see to it that your family's own place here becomes far less certain. Do I make myself clear?" Ilara, who had been listening from the doorway, felt anger rise hot in her chest. But before she could speak, Adrian stepped forward from where he had been standing near the fire. "There is no need to threaten this family," Adrian said, his voice carrying a calm authority that Ilara had not heard from him before. "I will leave when I choose to leave, and you would do well to remember that your position exists to serve the people of this estate, not to frighten them into silence." Croft's face went pale, then red with anger. "And who exactly do you think you are, to speak to me this way?" For a long moment, Adrian said nothing. Then, quietly, he said, "Someone who has seen enough, Mr. Croft. Someone who intends to see a great deal more before this matter is finished." Something in his tone made Croft hesitate, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face, as though some old instinct warned him to be careful. But he said nothing more, only turned sharply and left, his carriage rattling away down the muddy road. When he was gone, Ilara turned to Adrian, her heart pounding. "What was that? You spoke to him as though—" She stopped, searching his face. "As though you had every right to command him." Adrian closed his eyes briefly, as though gathering the last of his strength for what he had to say. "Ilara," he said, "I think it is time I told you the truth." They sat together by the fire that night, and Adrian spoke at last. "My name is Adrian Voss," he said. "That much was true, but it is not the whole of my name. I am Adrian Voss Ashcombe, the Duke of Ashcombe. This land, this village, the estate that Mr. Croft manages, it is mine." Ilara stared at him, too stunned to speak. "I came here in secret," he continued, "because I had received letters, anonymous letters, warning me that my steward was treating the tenants unfairly, while reporting to me that all was well. I did not know who to trust, so I decided to see for myself, without the title that would have made every man bow and lie to my face instead of showing me the truth. I never expected to be attacked on the road, or to end up wounded in your stable yard, but I am grateful, more than I can say, that I did. You lied to me, Alara said, her voice trembling, not only with hurt, but with the effort of trying to understand. For 2 weeks, you let me believe you were someone you were not. I did, Adrian admitted, and I am sorry for it, but please understand, if I had told you the truth from the beginning, everything would have changed. You would have treated me differently. Perhaps you would not have let me stay at all, and I would never have come to know you as I have. Not as a duke speaking to a tenant, but simply as a man speaking to a woman he has come to care for, deeply. Alara said nothing for a long while, staring into the fire, her thoughts in turmoil. She was angry, genuinely angry, at the deception, at the weeks spent not knowing who she had truly welcomed into her home and her heart. And yet, she could not deny that everything he had shown her, his kindness, his willingness to work, his concern for the village and its people, none of that had been false, whatever his name. I need time, she said finally, time to think about what this means. Adrian nodded, understanding in his eyes despite the pain that flickered there. Take whatever time you need, he said. I will not press you. But know this, Alara. Duke or stranger, my feelings for you were never a disguise. Adrian returned to the manor house the next morning, and word spread through the village like wildfire once his true identity became known. Within days he had called Mr. Croft before him, along with the estate's account books, and the truth of years of unfair dealing came to light. Rents raised beyond what was reasonable, harvest reports falsified, tenant families threatened when they could not pay debts that should never have been so high in the first place. Croft was dismissed from his position that same week, his years of quiet cruelty finally brought to an end. Adrian personally visited every family in the village, the Hendersons among them, to correct the injustices that had been done, and to promise fair treatment going forward. The village, which had lived so long under fear, began to breathe easier. But it was 2 weeks before Adrian returned to the inn, not as Adrian Voss, the wounded traveler, but as himself, in a fine carriage with the ducal crest upon its door, dressed in clothes that spoke plainly of who he truly was. Alara watched him approach from the same window where she had first seen him stumbling through the storm, and her heart, despite everything, began to race. He came to her not with grand speeches but simply, humbly, hat in hand. I know I hurt you, he said. I know that trust, once broken, is not easily mended. But I did not come here today as the Duke of Ashcombe. I came as the man who chopped your wood, who mended your fences, who sat by your fire and found, for the first time and longer than he can say, that he did not want to be anywhere else. I am asking you, Alara, not for your forgiveness alone, though I hope for that too, but for your hand. I want to build a life with the woman who cared for a stranger without knowing, or caring, what he was. Alara looked at him for a long moment, weighing the hurt of the deception against the truth of everything else she had seen in him, his kindness, his fairness, the way he had acted the moment he had the power to make things right. I will marry you, she said finally, on one condition, that you promise me honesty, from this day forward, in all things, no matter how difficult the truth may be. I promise, Adrian said, and the relief and joy in his face were unmistakable. The village prospered in the years that followed, its people treated fairly under a duke who had learned, in the most unexpected way, what it truly meant to walk among his tenants rather than simply rule over them. Alara became Duchess of Ashcombe, but those who visited the old inn sometimes still found her there, an apron over her fine dress, laughing with her father as she had always done, unable, and unwilling, to fully leave behind the life where she had once opened her door to a wounded stranger, never knowing that in doing so, she had opened her heart to a duke.